Jonah and the whale, or the big fish, as apparently all of the translations of the Bible have it. It's a story that we likely know from our Sunday school days if we grew up going to Sunday school, where this guy Jonah ends up in the belly of a whale. Now, if you're like me, that's the extent of what we know about the story of Jonah and the whale. But this week, I took time to read the entire book. It's 4 chapters. I recommend you read the whole thing. But when we read the whole thing, what stood out to me this week is how Jonah tries to get out of doing what God wants him to do. God wants Jonah to go to Nineveh and to bring word to the people that they're not doing what God wants them to do. They're not following God, they're doing evil things or whatever it is. Jonah says, sure, and then changes his mind. He goes to Joppa and he gets on a boat. Basically, he goes as far in the other direction of Nineveh as you can get. Perhaps this sounds familiar. Perhaps when we have a sense of what God might like for us to do, or really anything on our to-do list that we don't want to do, we start out good intentioned and then change our minds, go in a different direction. Now, there's good news here. The good news is that this is not the end of the story. The resounding truth that comes in this story is that God keeps trying to get Jonah back on track. So, Jonah goes the wrong direction. Jonah gets on a boat. So there's a big storm. God's like, hey, come on, you got to get back out of this boat and get going in the right direction. The sailors, as we heard in the kids' version, throw Jonah overboard to try to help move along to the right direction. There's the giant fish, again, to get him out of this sea, to get him going back in the right direction. Now, you might think that when the fish spits Jonah back up, that's the end of the story, but it's not. This is just chapter 2. We got 2 more chapters to go. So in the third of the 4 chapters, God says to Jonah, hey, get up and go to Nineveh. God keeps saying, come on, Jonah, you can do it. You can do the right thing. Let's go. This time, Jonah goes. And if you read it, though, Jonah's still not happy. He is still really rathering not go to Nineveh. And so he sort of grumbles the word to the people and is like, hey, people, you should stop doing what you're doing. You should follow God. Despite Jonah, and despite his lack of enthusiasm, the people in Nineveh do turn from their evil ways and they do come to know God. Cool. Story's still not over. In chapter 4, we hear this. Jonah thought this was utterly wrong and became angry. The people did what God wanted them to, and Jonah is mad. He prayed to God with what I think is a fair amount of attitude. If you've ever encountered anybody with attitude, this is what I imagine, right? He prayed, come on, God. I knew that you are gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and ready to relent from punishing. Jonah did not want these people in Nineveh, to be spared by a gracious God. What about that? Jonah did not seem to like these people in Nineveh and did not want to point to them and say, hey, do the right thing by God, and God's going to do the right thing by you. Despite Jonah, wanting to ignore God, despite Jonah wanting to keep God's grace to himself, despite all of this, God does God's thing. God brings mercy, God brings grace to the people of Nineveh who had been doing the wrong thing. They had been ignoring God. And God does all of this despite Jonah going the wrong way, despite Jonah being a bit snippy. Friends, Jonah does his best to thwart God's plan. And despite all that, lives are changed. There we go. It's awesome. Okay, so lives are changed in the story of Jonah. If we think about our church, we can think about where lives are changed when we've been eager to point others to God. Kids come in to get one of their friends and encourage them to come play. That's where lives are changed. I think about the rainbow banner that we have outside that shows a welcome to those who are often excluded from church. I think about our ministry to the students at Spreckles Elementary School down the way, where last year we were able to provide food for those students who were very housing insecure, who were recent refugees to this country. I think about when we have memorial services here, and in the midst of grief, we are able to provide space and solace for people. Indeed, there are ways that we point others to God and we provide space for God to do God's thing in our midst. But the harder question is, when are we reluctant like Jonah? Now, I venture to guess that sometime in the last nearly 60 years as a church, there's been some times where God might have been nudging us and we've been like, nope, going this other way. We need to heed the book of Jonah, where we read to the very end, not stopping with the spitting out of the giant fish part, but we get to the end and we are reminded that God's mercy, God's grace, God's justice is for everyone. We remember that just because others are offered God's mercy and love does not mean that we get less. It reminds me of this thing I've seen going around, that equal rights does not mean fewer rights for you. It's not pie. Okay? There's plenty of God's grace, God's love to go around. God asks Jonah toward the end, should I not be concerned about the people of Nineveh? Now, Jonah, even though it's almost the end of the book, he does not respond, well, of course you should be. He instead is still kind of sulky. He's still kind of mad. He doesn't affirm that at all. So what would we do if we hear God say, should I not be concerned about folks who live below the 8? Should I not be concerned about immigrants coming across the border? Should I not be concerned about folks who identify as non-binary? Should I not be concerned about people living on the street? Well, if we learn from Jonah, our answer should be a resounding yes. Yes, you should be, and yes, we should be. God cares about the people of Nineveh, not at the expense of Jonah, but in addition to. And God cares about the folks who live below the 8, the immigrants coming across the border, the non-binary folks, the homeless folks, all the folks, not at our expense, but in addition to us. When we realize that God's care for others doesn't come at our expense, we move from a mindset of scarcity of God's care and love to a mindset of abundance. There is more than enough for all of us. So this stewardship season, when we think about our giving, we might be tempted to say, what if we don't get enough money? What then? A scarcity mindset. I invite us to turn that instead to say, imagine all we can do if our community shares what we have. Imagine that mindset of abundance. So in this short book of Jonah, which you're all going to read this afternoon, right? It ends, you might think, with Jonah changing his ways, seeing the light. Nope. It ends with Jonah pouting and sulking and being cranky. Still, I find this incredibly good news because God uses the crankiest people. Jonah made it into our sacred book despite his pouting, despite his going the wrong way, despite his not wanting to do it, despite his not wanting the people of Nineveh to receive God's mercy and love. So it stands to reason that if God can do that with Jonah, God can take us in our imperfection and use us as vehicles of grace and love, even when we're cranky, even when we fear scarcity. But imagine, just imagine if we respond with a yes when God nudges the first time, so we don't have to go through that whole storm bit and the fish bit and all of that. Imagine what would happen when we respond to our God from a mindset of abundance. So, when we might feel tempted to throw a Jonah-sized temper tantrum and pout and complain that it's not fair, that we don't want to, just imagine. Imagine that lives are being changed. Imagine God's abundance for all. Thanks be to God. Amen.